Welcome back to the Astro Podcast. Today we are here again with Günther Oestmann to discuss some interesting details of the life of the astronomer and astrologer Johann Pfaff. Welcome back to the podcast.
So
Thank you very much.
Could you tell us who Johannes Pfaff was?
Yeah. Johannes Wilhelm Andreas Pfaff was born in 1774 in Stuttgart. Is not very well known. His elder brother, Johann Friedrich, was a famous mathematician in the time of Carl Friedrich Gauss, is much better known in the history of science. Johann Friedrich's younger brother studied in Tübingen at the famous Protestant theological seminar, which is called Stift, even existing until today. But in Tübingen, he acquired also knowledge in natural sciences, and he must have had contact with the astronomer Bohnenberger in Tübingen. Bohnenberger had been appointed as a professor in 1798. I have researched the life and work of Pfaff for some years, and also went to Tübingen and consulted the archive of the Stift, and got and there I found some details concerning his studies. Were quite interesting, because it emerged that Pfaff obviously had no inclinations becoming Protestant clergyman, and this can be clearly seen from the records of his education, which are still extant until today. There are numerous criticisms and even harsh judgments concerning his studies and his readings and general behavior and so on. But I was informed that these were massive. There were harsh, those were really almost acid criticism as well of his studies and also of his personality. But I was informed that this was quite common in these days, because the administration of the Stift reacted harshly in these times, because the ideas of the French Revolution had obviously spread among the students at Tübingen University, and the reactions were extremely hard to all these, to all sorts of insubordination and whatever. So I think Pfaff was not as much as an exception, I think.
Okay.
So they were all young revolutionaries by then.
I found one of the final assessments, which was a bit poisoned, I think. There was a remark, he did not neglect studying theology at all, or completely. He did not neglect studying theology completely.
Completely, okay.
Not completely.
Not completely.
Completely.
Yeah. It was Anyway,
in his spare time, he could just.
His inclinations were clearly more towards natural sciences and especially astronomy. And in 1802, he went to Dorpat, to Russia, and he had been appointed as professor of mathematics at the newly refounded University of Dorpat, nowadays Tartu in Estonia, which had been reopened under the Russian government. And I've also consulted the records, archival records in Tartu of his appointment, which were quite interesting because his elder brother had established connections, so to speak, and had obviously made some recommendations of his younger brother. And finally, the vote was for Pfaff, and he went to Russia in 1802 and also became director of the projected observatory, which was later finished under the famous astronomer Wilhelm Struve. And at some time, it is not yet clear when Pfaff exactly became interested in astrology, but it must have been already. It must have been already in the time he spent in Dorpat, because in there's a letter stating that Pfaff was working on the translation of Kepler's Harmonici Mundi already in 1810. At this time, he was back in Germany already. He did not stay very long in Dorpat, and this was mainly due to the difficult living conditions, which were obviously very expensive, and also the administration of the university, or the state administration of the university, was obviously difficult to endure. They had a very strict regime and and supervision of all professors and so on. So it was, at the time, the living conditions in Dorpat were obviously difficult at the time. And Pfaff tried to get a post in Germany and finally succeeded and moved to Nuremberg, where so-called Real Institute had just been opened, with Gotthilf Heinrich Schubert as head, as director. Schubert was a very important and influential natural philosopher. And when Pfaff arrived at Nuremberg, soon a deep friendship developed between Schubert and Pfaff.
So what was his age by then, when he returned to Germany?
He returned to Germany, let me see, he returned to Germany in 1809. That is, he was quite a young man. He was born in 1774. He was quite young.
Very young, yes.
He had married a lady from Livland, nowadays Lithuania, Estonia, and Livonia, and this lady followed him to Nuremberg, and he was quite young when he arrived in Nuremberg.
Yeah, already married.
yeah,
married young. So yes.
And do you think? It's not. Maybe the question would be, how would his astrological inclinations or his astrological curiosity would be received in the academia? So,
yes, because we're already in an epoch where astrology has completely fallen
18th century.
from acceptability in terms of science.
I think Pfaff's astrological inclinations already date back to his times as a student in Tübingen. Because in Tübingen, there was a professor of physics, Johann Gottlieb Christoph Friedrich Pfleiderer, and Pfleiderer was an admirer of Johannes Kepler, and he encouraged students to study Johannes Kepler. And I think Pfaff was in contact with Pfleiderer, and I think he was influenced by Pfleiderer's Kepler studies. I think it was not by chance that he tried to translate the Harmonici Mundi in 1810.
Yeah.
Yes.
And this might be categorized as a rather academic issue, but in 1816, Pfaff published his Astrologie, or a small booklet. Well, this was an interesting mixture of historical research and, well, and an attempt to validate astrology, or to resurrect astrological thought again. And, well, this was not well received among his colleagues.
I can imagine.
Severely and harshly criticized for this.
Well, this was the beginning of the 19th century. It was,
yeah.
Astrology was like in a whole-time low at that point.
And it was a time of big triumphs of celestial mechanics, and, well, it was the time of Laplace's Mécanique Céleste and so on, and the researches of Carl Friedrich Gauss, mathematical and astronomical researches, and this clearly did not fit well. But it's maybe of some interest to quote a letter by Pfaff, because he had sent a copy of his book to Bernhard von Lindenau, who was the editor of the Zeitschrift für Astronomie, an astronomical periodical. And Lindenau obviously, well, I think he sent the letter with the intention of a review or something. And Lindenau obviously reacted somewhat irritated and asked for an explanation of this very strange book. And this letter is not extant, but Pfaff's answer is, I could find this letter had been printed partly by von Lindenau in this periodical, Zeitschrift für Astronomie, and by an incredible chance of luck, I found the original on the net some years ago. And it is, well, I've translated the central passages into English. It is, of course, written in a very old-fashioned German style. So, and this is all, I hope this is also reflected in the English translation in some way. But this letter is very interesting and significant because Pfaff, well, speaks openly about his motivations and thoughts when occupying himself with astrology. And I may quote the following passages. And Pfaff says, well, for more than 10 years, I've occupied myself with astrology. I felt that it deserved to be mentioned in popular lectures. Earlier, I only had a few works at hand, although some, viewed historically, made a marked impression on me. Certainly, Ptolemy's book, that is the Tetrabiblos, also had several curiosities for me. Finally, I did not know either the origin nor the end of this mysterious system. I then only knew the Mysterium, Cosmographicum by Kepler. Later, I became acquainted with his harmony, that is the Harmonice Mundi, also with his letters, the astrological movements of his time, and Kepler's views, which were so different from those of his age. Thus, a number of things were collected, and the decision originated for establishing a monument to astrological belief. I collected what was available in my vicinity, looked around a bit in Arabic, and went for aphorisms, paragraphs, and sentences in many times and legends. Up to now, your highborn will find everything good ordered. But now the question arose, which spirit should be blown into this lump of paper? Your highborn has written to me absolutely correctly, the historical critical spirit. But for several reasons, this was impossible for me. Auxiliary means were missing. My reading was insufficient. Finally, I was convinced that astrological belief, like other things, went through tradition. Therefore, no proof could be furnished about its origin. Therefore, a hypothesis had to be put forward. Admittedly, it was easy to say that it was clerical deception or misunderstood couchings of astronomical truths or false application of otherwise correct propositions, but I was unable to supply evidence. Moreover, Kepler's work and nature had to be described, for he certainly was an astrologer. That is, he believed in a connection of the celestial bodies with life on Earth. It is true, he went into many mistakes, but the nature, the mind, the life in which he did it must be of interest for everybody, keeping himself receptive to the ambition of a great genius. It is in this sense that I have said, that I declared, he has written the spirit of legislation, and it appeared curious to me that he despised common astrology, but tried rescuing this belief against his age. For these reasons, I had to give up the historical critical way, and gave another tone and mood to the whole. To refute astrological belief, which had declined long ago, would have been untimely. To defend and praise it in this age, which has more serious things to do, would not be decent also. So it was the plan to draw the image of astrological belief with all clarity and art, so to speak, from the soul of an astrologer in varied form and style, but endowing the whole with a swaying movement, so that clarity would appear cloudy and the art mighty again. Finally, the whole should be taken in such a way that none of the common people, in a broader sense, could learn astrology from this in order to use it. I was successful in the latter, because many a thing is indistinct for me too. This is the history of astrology, for which your highborn were not without concern for me in your last letter. I do not believe that I have made interventions in astronomy. Also, it is probably not so harmful if there existed a comet like nature among astronomers, perhaps me. If they only move all around the sun of truth and nobody takes the other one away with him. After all the planets interfere with each other. It's a highly interesting testimony.
It is, absolutely. It's delicious. And the final reference to heliocentrism around the sun of truth. And also, he repeatedly refers to astrology as a belief, except that in the end, he calls it an art. It's very interesting. No, it is. It's really interesting. Yeah. And the way he puts it, like, I did it in a way that no common people could learn from it. Because it's dangerous and not decent.
Yes.
It's amazing. Mm-hmm. And also, the only sources that he mentions by name is Ptolemy and Kepler. And then he mentions the Arabs.
There are other Latin treatises which have been quoted by him in his book. Mm-hmm. It is, the book is a bit, it's a bit, it is written aphoristically, indeed. Mm-hmm. There are paragraphs dealing with a certain topic, and then he moves to another thing. It is, it's a rather bit zigzag. It's not it is not an actual treatise, one might say. It is, more a collection of associations with some historical sources and so on.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, but it is interesting that, I don't know what other sources he mentioned, but he mentions Kepler repeatedly, at least in this segment of the letter. And Kepler seems to be, for him, like his ticket to decency, it's ticket to academia. Like, if Kepler did this, we are okay. we are decent. That's interesting.
And do you think this book has any parallels, either in Germany or elsewhere, in terms of this?
No, this was really a singular case in this time, and even for most part of the 19th century until the end of the century.
Yes,
and of course, Pfaff's case of a conversion. Mm-hmm. Of the conversion of a professional astronomer to astrology. This was a very, very unique case, I think.
Yes, because we can find this kind of work perhaps later on in the century, just by the end of the century, as we turn into the 20th century, then it begins to to be common in
Yes.
this kind of discussion and an historical revival, an
The
historical
Theosophical
study.
Society.
Yeah, indeed, yeah.
But was
and
the
even in
was-
academia.
Yeah, and even in academia,
Yeah.
yes. But was the book published?
The book was published.
I mean, by this editor, because it could have been rejected and then.
No, Pfaff had the book printed. It was published in Nuremberg in 1816.
Oh, okay.
And he sent a copy to Bernhard von Lindenau.
This is
It was. I found some reviews of the book,
Okay.
highly critical reviews, and his colleagues, astronomers like Bode in Berlin, thought Pfaff had become insane. Indeed.
I can imagine all the jokes he had to endure.
Yeah,
in his life.
he was harshly criticized for this, really, and his reputation was ruined, I have to say. Yeah.
I'm curious of something. He went on to practicing astrology. Do we know of his practice? Did he become an astrologer, practicing astrologer, or just had this?
Just wrote about it.
Curiosity?
I found some private records. He obviously cast horoscopes, but only privately.
Okay.
He did not publish anything on it, but his activities as a publisher did not stop with his book, because he then embarked on a translation on a German translation of the Tetrabiblos. He started editing a so-called astrological pocketbook, which only 2 volumes appeared in the early 20s, the 19th century. And in this pocketbook, he first published the first 2 books of the Tetrabiblos, followed by the 2 others, and a number of essays. Also, there was also a number of essays by his colleague Gottlieb Heinrich Schubert, and he published sources concerning Kepler. For example, the witch trial of his mother and extracts of his letters and so on. That is, he occupied himself with Kepler's writings. Okay. And this is quite interesting. And he continued working on this when he moved first to Würzburg University and then to Erlangen. He was forced to move there because the Real Institute in Nuremberg was closed by the government. And he was, how it's called, he was a professor, and he was first moved to Würzburg and then to Erlangen as an extraordinary professor of mathematics. And by the way, there is you can frequently read this on the net and in some modern astrological dictionaries that with Pfaff's death in 1835, the last chair of astrology was closed at a German university, which is complete nonsense.
Yes, it doesn't make
Pfaff
sense.
was a professor of mathematics and physics, and there was no chair of astrology.
Yeah.
But he was still working and researching on astrological topics, and I found at least 1 lecture which dealt with astrometeorology.
Okay.
Oh.
Okay.
And there was also some influence of Pfaff on his students. There is, I've found, it was known that Count von Platen, poet, Count von Platen referred to Pfaff in a comedy, which was written by him. It has a very strange title, The Fatal Fork.
The Fatal Fork.
Fatal Fork. It is, and there's a quite interesting quotation of Pfaff's astrology. Hold on a second. I've got it somewhere. Count von Platen, well, mentioned Pfaff in his comedy The Fatal Fork. In This was a very successful, at this time, a very successful satirical comedy. And in Act 1, a Jew named Shmuel boasted about having read Pfaff's astrology. And sort of Dr. Faustus or whatever. And Shmuel exclaims, "I am a great astronomer and necromancer. All secret powers of nature are well known to me. Still in Leipzig, I gave myself up, as you know, to the dark arts and chemical studies, and to chiromancy and pyromancy and necromancy of Agrippa. Then I read for myself Pfaff's astrology, and in Göttingen I carried on the art of geomancy, but I did it secretly, because already a thinker is called there a visionary." Quite interesting, isn't it?
So the book was known for him to use it like that.
It was known, and Bode remarked in his severe criticism of Pfaff in the Astronomical Yearbook, Berlin Astronomical Yearbook, that he had heard that booksellers had sold quite a number of copies, and that the book was obviously quite popular at this time.
That's interesting. I have one question regarding the book, and if he deals with this, which is, by that time we already had the discovery of Uranus, because does he mention that, or does he make any commentaries on these new discoveries by this time?
He has indeed commented about this, but he did not. I have the exact quotation not at hand, unfortunately, but he mentioned, of course, he was well aware as an astronomer of these discoveries, but he thought that the traditional number of 7 planets was sufficient and for astrology.
Okay. Because that's interesting, because we usually have in the case of the astronomic discoveries, we have the Galilean discoveries and all that revolution that goes in astronomy and how it affects astrology or doesn't affect astrology. But when we come to the big discovery, which is the new planets and the continuation of the solar system, astrology does no longer have the voice that it had back then. We have really few reflections on the impact of these, but in the astrological practice. That's why I asked, because it's interesting that he says that and has that posture, which is quite curious.
He was very historically orientated. That is, reading classical texts and Renaissance texts and so on, and even older treatises. Apart from this rather popular reception, he also wrote some articles for the Morgenblatt für gebildete Stände, issue published in Stuttgart, with some astrological, let's say, allusions. These were, this was, we may call it today popular science. But his research activities and interest in astrology had very important results, because Christian Frisch, who had studied with Pfaff in Erlangen, was the editor of the first critical edition of Kepler's works. And there are direct connections to this reception of Kepler in the circle of Pfaff in Erlangen, and these connections have been researched by a philosopher, Professor Ziche in Utrecht, recently, who was probably he has written a book on the reception of Kepler and on Schelling's reception of Kepler, and has unearthed very important documents. And there's a direct connection back to Pfaff and to his reception of Kepler. That is the first critical edition of Kepler's works is closely linked to Pfaff's activities and research work.
Okay, yeah.
It is quite interesting.
Yes, it is. It is, and in fact, he's almost, in terms of his posture, is a more historical and a traditionalist in terms of how astrology should be seen, at least. Not.
Yeah.
Okay.
I am also curious about his work because it was so completely different from what was being done at this time.
Indeed.
And also, if there is some connection with what we can call German astrology that was very strong and very prominent in the beginning, 1 century later, in the beginning of the 20th century, because it was very specific. We had very good and prominent astrologers in Germany in the beginning of the 20th century. Is there any connection to this author?
Well, the interest in Pfaff's works revived again at the beginning of 20th century. Wilhelm Knappich wrote a first biography, I think in around 1910. And in the heyday of astrology in Germany in the 20s and 30s, Pfaff was remembered again. And also his German translation of the Tetrabiblos was reprinted in the journal Zenit. And this
Zenit, yes.
and this translation was reprinted again after Second World War by a small publishing house near Hanover. This edition can still be bought. This is still available on the net infrequently.
The Zenit, for just to let people know, was a magazine, an astrological magazine that was published in the beginning of the 20th century in Germany and in German language. And I had the pleasure of reading, well, at least seeing some of the originals at the Warburg Institute.
Yeah,
a few of them, and then it disappeared. But at least this author was somehow preserved, and his work survived in the Zenit.
And also shows a link that exists between the fall of astrology at the end of the 17th century, and then a sort of continuation in these authors, these individual revival, and then establish a link to then a revival of the practice, if we can call it that, at the beginning of the 20th century.
Because we often don't know what happened between what we call the fall of astrology and its revival. We don't know. So these individuals that were completely out of their time, they help us to understand that period.
Because I think usually that most people investigating this kind of history are connected to the history of science, and astrology sort of drops out of history of science once it's no longer considered a science. So the study of astrology within the history of science ends at the beginning of the 18th century. After there on, we're usually talking about history of occultism, esotericism, cultural, and other topics. So it drops out of things. And it's interesting to see that there is a gap, because we do have a practice of astrology continuously until today. And it's interesting to see how that jump occurs. And especially, it's particularly interesting to see a revival of a traditional view of astrology at such a later date. So it's sort of a stepping stone to other revivals that occur at the beginning of the 20th century. So the publishing of the Tetrabiblos
but at the same time, Pfaff was a traditionalist, yes, but at the same time, he seems to be very enamored with Kepler and Kepler's ideas. And so it is interesting to see how he managed to put everything together. Ptolemy's work and Kepler's work, and carry this to
just a question, and I know this is a complex, doesn't need to be too much detailed. The book itself, Is it a book that teaches
No.
something on astrology, or it just speaks about it historically and gives out the general idea?
It's a
Yeah,
decent book.
it is not well. It is not well. It is not an organized textbook.
Okay.
That is, well, let's compare it to your treatise, which is a systematically arranged sequence of topics. Then you will not find anything comparable in Pfaff's book.
Okay.
There are, of course, for example, he describes the dignities, essential and accidental dignities of planets, and he also reproduces a table. I think it was of Schönes, the Unitis Nativitatum, and he also describes the correlations of elements with planets and so on, and aspects and whatever. But it is not very systematic.
Okay, it's not always in a didactical way. It's just
he tries to give a broad picture of astrological thought with some historical digressions and so on, and also the structure of the book is quite interesting because he has arranged it. He has arranged the chapters according to the 12 signs of the zodiac. Chapters have names of the signs, that is starting with Aries and so on.
Oh, so he goes into astrology, but I think in the letter that you wrote, and the letter that you read some parts, he says that he was careful enough not to let the common people learn.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, this is a decent book. This is a book that is just to talk about astrology, but not to teach about astrology.
Yeah, and I think this book has some romantic spirit that is it is full of illusions, and he was obviously fascinated in some way of astrology, and this is you will not find many technical details in it. But anyway, he describes some things, but it is not a textbook of astrology.
Okay.
In fact,
but it has a value on its own because it's probably the result of its own period and the result of that person. It is. So, and then obviously because of what you told us, he had some participation in the creation of astrological material. And did he pursue any more academic? He was a teacher of mathematics. So my question, I guess, is the fact of being an astrologer, or at least as being a sympathizer of astrology, did not prevent his academic, not totally prevent his academic career.
No, he taught. He lectured on astronomical topics, and he lectured physics and so on, and also published some papers, and also he wrote a textbook on physics.
Oh, so
that is he wrote parallel on these things, but aside from astrology, he was obviously very was interested in many things, obviously, and he also he started learning Sanskrit, for example, and he also wrote a polemic against Jean-François Champollion on Champollion's translation of hieroglyphs. And it's quite fascinating to say. The title is the wisdoms of the Egyptians and the learned French.
So he knew a little bit of everything. He was eclectic.
He also translated treatises. There's for example, a book on mineralogy by Berzelius. He translated this from Swedish, obviously, and also wrote a book on Old German literature. That is, he was a multifaceted person. He was by no means interested in astronomy and mathematics alone.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was a bit of everything. He was an eclectic person.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
Oh yes, fascinating.
Yeah.
I found a very curious remark in one of his observation diaries, which are still kept in the in the state archive in Tartu, and this was, well, of course, an array of numbers of sun and star observations, and well, and on one paper there's a single sentence, and it is translated. Well, translation is what is man calculating, or calculating man, and the answer is nothing. Very strange. Only a short sentence.
A philosopher.
Yeah. That was quite interesting, because it's very fascinating to hear, to see this practice and this revival and this reconsideration of astrology at such a later date. And I think that's, for me, the fascinating topic here, and quite important, and the way, like I said before, of existing this stepping stone to the present, and seeing the tradition that ended still finding a revival and a little bit coming upwards again in this kind of work, which is quite interesting.
And also the strength of the tradition, because although he was fascinated obviously by Kepler, and Kepler being the genius that he was in many fields, still the astrological tradition managed to survive in a way. So it is also interesting to see that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh,
But Pfaff was very soon forgotten until he was rediscovered in the beginning of the 20th century.
Yes.
yeah, yes. But maybe some people are completely out of sync with their own time. But then some decades or even centuries later, they can have their own, I don't know, their own moment, so to say.
Yeah.
Maybe it's the case of Pfaff. Okay. Well, thank you very much for.
Thank you for presenting us
For
this
fascinating.
Thank you.
personality.
Only a very short introduction.
Yes, but I think I'll put a link to your paper on the
Yeah.
on the
And I hope. Well, I've given a talk on the reception of Kepler, and of course Pfaff is also mentioned there in St. Petersburg last year on the conference on the Harmonici Mundi of Kepler. This paper shall be published, I think, in Culture and Cosmos.
Okay.
Oh, okay. That would be.
Okay, so
We can also link whenever it is published.
We can also put links so
be
people can access the whole information and the whole discussion. On the topic.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much.
I have to thank you.
And we hope to see you in the future for other discussions of
Another
of
idea.
this.
I'm looking forward to this. Yeah.
Topics. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.